Today, we are covering one single verse here in Deuteronomy chapter 19. We just had read for us the grand summation of verse 14. Of course, in the last 2 weeks, we've been going through this chapter. We covered the first 10 verses a fortnight ago. Last week, we looked at verses 11 to 13, all centered around the rather heavy subject of justice and the grave injustice that can occur by showing pity, in that misplaced sense of pity, toward evil and injustice in society that alleviates ourselves morally and emotionally but can actually perpetuate injustice. Today, we are somewhat changing tune in this grand section of the chapter, which is really focused on various different elements, pillars of societal justice, as we might otherwise say. In this central section of the book of Deuteronomy, of course, we're familiar with what we've been going through, the various commands for the ideal society. One might say it's a bit of a loose term, but certainly the natural order of how God has constructed a faithful, righteous, and just Christian society to operate. We looked at all the different offices of the state, like judges and magistrates and the king, as well as those for the church, coming through in that particularly chapter 18, of course. And here are the various different instructions given over this chapter, as well as others to come, regarding these very seminal issues of the law and of truth and of righteousness. This one here seems rather odd in the placing of where we do find it, of course. And it mentions something about not moving a bunch of rocks. Okay? To be more specific and less jovial, it harkens to the concept herein contained of not moving boundary stones that have been established, in other words, set up by one's ancestors. So what on earth is that possibly talking about? We do have to do the very brief work of journeying through history and understanding what this is referring to, of course, so many thousands of years ago in these forms. When it speaks of boundary stones, the description is fairly straightforward and hopefully should not be difficult for us to be able to collectively understand. It refers to stones, be they walls or usually in many cases just singular piles of rocks, what would be called cairns, for example, C-A-I-R-N-S, like the city up in Queensland, cairns, which is a pile of stones stacked on top of each other that would be an obvious landmark, obviously manually created by people, to mark out particular boundaries or, as the term suggests, landmarks. Okay, to where we get that otherwise term from. It can be used in the literal sense for boundaries, so the marking of boundaries of properties. It could be used to establish the centre points of territories. It could be used for a variety of different scenarios in the ancient world and even in the medieval world, according to different purposes. In this case here, when it is speaking of boundary stones, it is primarily referring to land allotments. Okay? So in other words, the designatory markers of your property. Okay? That's the immediate context of what this is specifically referring to. So when we have the words given, to remind you again of what the sentence literally says, Moses speaking, quote, "You shall not move your neighbour's boundary mark, which the ancestors have set, in your inheritance which you shall inherit in the land that the Lord your God gives you to possess." Okay? Your neighbour's boundary marks, or boundary stones, same thing, is giving the idea here of the context of what's being talked about. Okay? Your neighbours, in other words, the people of your nation who live nearby you, okay, do not move their boundary marks, their boundary stones. And obviously, likewise, should not be done toward you. Other people should not move your boundary marks. Okay? Now, the context of where this seemingly passing sentence finds itself gives us a bit of an idea that allows us to establish the foundation of what we're looking at here today. Okay? It finds itself amidst a passage, of course, coming off of the first 13 verses, which we subdivided, regarding cities of refuge and the administration of justice in society. Okay? What this should give us, especially with the more heavy atmosphere of last week's sermon and the content therein from verses 11 to 13, about not pitying the one who does wicked things, but rather purging the blood of the innocent, in other words, administering due justice on behalf of those otherwise affected. This kind of heaviness, as I say, to use that word again, of material should give us indication that this is actually something rather serious, that this is not a trivial matter. This is not something that we can simply gloss over, glide by, or just merely pass up. It finds itself here in this particular context, in this chapter for our sake, for a reason. And it is much more beyond the mere establishment of the laws of private property, even though that is, of course, precisely what it is doing. At its root, theologically, the fundamental reason, before we begin to move on to other aspects of application, as to why this is being commanded, is because the fundamental theological and philosophical principle that is at work here in the background is that God is the one who gives and takes away all things. Okay? He is the creator of the cosmos. He is Lord of the universe. He is the one by whom and in whom and through whom and for whom we have our very existence. As the Apostle Paul in Athens in Acts chapter 17 quotes from many of the great ancient Greek poets like Epimenides of Crete, in him, in God, we live and move and have our very being. Okay? All that we have, all that we know, be it great or be it small, be it middling, it matters not, comes from the grace and the love and the compassion of God. This is why our Lord Jesus Christ is able to say to those who are anxious and worrisome about the things in life, particularly the material things in life, does God not care for even the little sparrow? He will surely care, therefore, for you, because your life, no matter who you are or where you are from, is of greater significance than that of the sparrow. God bless it. He is the source of everything. Everything that exists is found and sourced in him. Therefore, everything that we have as his creation, as his creatures, comes therefore as well from, through, and by him. Okay? This does many things, of course, beginning with the attitude of humility in realizing that everything that we know and love and have is from the good graces and blessings of the bounteous compassion of God. That's a whole separate sermon. But in this particular context here, what that does establish is that to those whom the Lord has given, no one else can rightly, of their own volition, take away. Does that make sense? It is why we have the very straightforward command, you shall not steal. The very concept, the very thought, the very premise of stealing, of theft, requires there to be a delineation, a demarcation, a difference, a distinction, or any other alliterative word beginning with D that you would like to use, between things that are yours and things that are not yours. If everyone has everything in common, then by nature there can be no theft. Right? It would be irrational to suggest otherwise. Okay? You couldn't make sense of that, let alone the actual underlying problem behind theft, which of course is the 10th commandment, the very commandment that lies at the root of all of commands 5 through 9. You shall not covet. And then the short list of various things included there. It's covetousness that drives theft. It is the unrighteous desire to take that which is fundamentally not yours. There are microcosmic, small little examples of this. There are gigantic, history-defining, world-altering examples of this, and everything else in between. Okay? That is the foundational metaphysical reality behind, of course, those commandments in the law, but here for us, verse 14 of Deuteronomy 19. Okay? You shall not move your neighbour's boundary mark, because it has been established as an inheritance from the Lord, just like yours has. Okay? The reason behind why one would do this is, of course, covetousness. It is greed. It is arrogance. It is hubris. It is all the various symptomatic sins that come from that root of covetousness. It is the covetous desire of the pride of the eyes that sees that of the other and wants it for the self, that then begets the arrogance and the presumptiveness of then actually moving the boundary mark, which then only further inculcates the hubris of thinking that A, you have the right to do that, and B, that you could ever get away with that, so on and so forth, right? It's just this never-ending stream of sins begetting sins. This is what is being commanded against. Now, part of the reasoning here as to why this specific societal or civil example of boundary lines of people's property is being used is because of the operative word in this particular verse: inheritance. Okay. It is not simply reduced down to the legal finitude of territorial disputes, okay, and the minutiae of lawsuits and of courts and of paperwork and of documentation and of all the other things which plague us now, right? It is about inheritance, because the land that your neighbour owns, when that man grows old, right, with his wife and they pass, to whom will that land now belong? Well, the son, right? The children more broadly. There's a double inheritance in the ancient world. It was actually common across the ancient world, including for the ancient Israelites. Double inheritance for the eldest son to a single portion for the rest of the sons. That's a very interesting sermon in its own right. Maybe one day we'll do that, right? Because there are Christological reasons as to why that's the case. Alas, it is inherited by the next generation. Okay? This is the normal operative pattern of how human society is to work. Again, regardless of which end of the spectrum or anywhere else in between one finds themselves, having little or having much, okay, regardless, the operative way of how God has designed the world to work is not to be isolated within one particular person or a people group or a generation, in this case we're talking about. It is a flow-on, as the fountain flows from one tier to the other, down throughout the generations. And ideally, there will be a nurturing and a stewardship and a growing of what one possesses, especially collectively as a people, that then flows forth to a generation that hopefully have been raised properly and have been raised to be good and valiant and virtuous peoples as Christians, that then build and grow on from there. Right? This is why so much of the wisdom literature speaks to this very subject. In fact, the most direct and obvious example of this, and you can turn there with me to see it with your own eyes, as short as it is in Proverbs chapter 13. Proverbs chapter 13. Much of the wisdom literature, of course, is consumed with these ideas of inheritances. It is consumed, of course, because by virtue of the fact that a great bulk of the Proverbs are written by King Solomon, and he is writing it to his son. It is a fatherly aspect, right, or orientation toward imparting one of the single most important inheritances that can be passed on, that of godly wisdom, right, true wisdom, okay? And so you will read many times, especially in the first 10 chapters of the book of Proverbs, my son, do this, da, 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 da. My son, avoid that, right? That kind of terminology, that's the contextual literary reason as to why that's going on, okay? But in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 22, so toward the tail end of the chapter, verse 22 of Proverbs chapter 13. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. That's the first half of that verse which I'm focusing on. Okay? Children's children, obviously referring to grandchildren, right? Grandkids. Okay? So it's not even just that the good man, the good father, the good patriarch of his household, right? He and his wife together. It's not that they just merely think about even their own direct children. They have what? Their grandchildren in mind. Now think about the wisdom here as to why this is very good advice. Okay? should that good man be only thinking, in the first instance that is, should he only begin to think about those children's children and what they'll inherit once they've been born, let alone grow up? No. That would not be very sage-like in one's planning. Because there are multitudes of things across the course of one's life that take time to build and to develop and to grow and to set in place, right? Even just in the material sense, let alone the spiritual aspect, which we'll talk about later. Okay? Now, what this sentence is inherently requiring is wisdom. The wisdom, as well as also, this is very important, the love. To actually gaze forth into the future, to take steps in the present that will impact and benefit your own descendants for generations, plural, to come. That is what the good man is called to do. And not just merely called to do, but something very particular here. That which the good man is defined by, okay, is defined by. Is not just merely saying the good man will do these things, right? Although, of course, that would be inherent. What this proverb is doing, this first half of this verse, is actually explaining to you the nature of a good man. A good man is one who leaves an inheritance for his children's children. Which means what? Well, the converse is true. In other words, the opposite. The one who does not leave an inheritance for his children's children is by definition what? Bad man. Okay. This is a moral standard. Right? This is why it has been consistently taught for thousands of years by the church that it is sinful fundamentally to not leave any inheritance to your children or your children's children at all, right? Not in the context of destitution, but in terms of those who actually have the capability of doing so and choosing not to by virtue of either blowing and wasting the money or by spending it on themselves, right? Whatever that happens to be. It doesn't have to be just money, right? It can be land, it can be a variety of things, right? There's all kinds of different measures by which wealth has been assessed, of course. But it is sinful. The reasoning for this comes in regard to spiritual things. As I said, we'll talk about that later on. But as the Apostle Paul himself says, he who does not care for his own people, most of all his own kin, his family, in other words, is worse than an unbeliever. Worse than. Okay? He's not saying that flippantly either. Right? Christians have a moral duty to care for and protect and provide for their family. Right? And then out of that, their neighbours, and out of that, their nation, right? These concentric circles in what is called the order amoris, right? The order of love. Okay? Rightly ordered love. The spouse, the children, the rest of the clan, i.e. we'll call extended family today, right? Your community, right? It includes your church, obviously, right? Like this place, so on and so forth. Okay? In the context here, the good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. Now, of course, in life, things don't pan out that way often. We often fail to do those things. There are times in which we don't do it. We haven't thought through. There are times where we may have screwed things up, to use that term, in past, and have later on repented. Of course, there is grace and mercy, like with all sins, for those who fail to do this. However, this is the operative order of how God has designed and commanded things to work for the benefit of us all. Because what happens when not just an individual, but even more consequently, a collective people en masse, not universally, but in general, fail to do this? Well, that is the very manner and means by which things decline. And in fact, things don't just merely decline, but decay. And they do not merely decay, but they are doomed to fall. Because the more and more that you expand out the failure to do this, the failure to provide inheritance for your children's children, or the failure to uphold the related command, obviously in the relationship to not moving your neighbour's boundary mark, all these kinds of things. As you expand that outward to more and more people, to a greater and greater degree, for more and more generations, what happens? Societies collapse. People groups, nations, civilizations no longer function for the simple fact that they can't. They can't. Because if there is a failure to faithfully transmit the past into the future, materially and spiritually, there is less of the thing that the next generation even has to work with, which means that unless they highly exceed the problems of that scenario, what's going to happen to the generation after them? They're going to have even less again, because you end up in this inverse compounding effect. It's the problem that we suffer with, by way of analogy to help us understand, with our population today. Right? We in Western countries, and really it's not only Western countries, there's a lot of countries around the world, are suffering dramatic population collapses, right? Well beyond what's called replacement rate. In other words, as parents, you need to have more than 2 kids to increase the population. 2 keeps the population at the same, roughly speaking. It's a bit more complex than that, but let's just go with that. And if you have less than that, what happens to the population? It goes down. Because if you have parents who have less kids, what does that now mean? There are less people alive to have kids. Mathematics just takes over. What does that mean for us in regard to this passage? Well, it means that if, in this case, we're talking about boundary marks and territories and things like that, property, wealth or inheritances, things that are passed on, right? If there is a failure to pass that on faithfully, what happens? That next generation has even less with which to live and work, to make something of. Which means for their children after them, in other words, the children's children of yourself, what happens? There's less to pass on, and they have even less again to live and work with. So though this command kind of slipped in here in the middle of chapter 19 about a pile of stones on a corner of a plot somewhere on a farm, seems rather passing. It is in fact actually not, but rather the opposite. Because when a people fail to uphold this command, in this case they do the opposite, they start messing with property, that which belongs to people, inheritances as the consequence of that, right, flowing on across the generations, right? Think of them as 2 sides of the same coin, okay, the same coin. When that starts getting messed with, really, really, really bad things begin to occur. When you zoom out across multiple generations. It is how many great kingdoms and empires and civilizations have fallen in the material sense. It is in every literal sense precisely what we are now going through ourselves. We are doing the very and exact same thing. Now, this is one of those parts that come up in sermons, right, where application, okay, comes to the fore, right? How do we understand the principles and the teachings of these ancient texts and apply them rightly and accurately to our own particular context or circumstance, maintaining the faithful meaning of those texts, right? Application. Where a seminal role of Pastor Michael and I's job is to actually directly address matters that pertain to us, right? Even when, and especially when, that means directly identifying the ways in which, as people, these kinds of things are committed, right, and undertaken. In this case, these kinds of sins are committed. We exist in a time where in our country, the United States, in Europe, in a bunch of different countries. Right? This idea, this practice I should really say, of the fudging of boundary marks, the ever-changing, or what we call moving of the goalposts in a different context, right, from sport, doesn't just occur daily, but is the very principle, as corrupted as it is, that undergirds vast swaths of our society. Okay? Particularly and especially when you talk about this kind of context, right, property, you're talking about things like economics, for example. Our entire economic structure is fundamentally based on doing this very thing. Because at the end of the day, ultimately, we talked about theft, right? You shall not steal, okay? But what is also going on there is fraud, right? Imagine yourself in this scenario thousands of years ago in the ancient world. You want this parcel of land from your neighbour. You don't have the integrity and the honour to purchase it from him, which would be what you should do. Instead, you just decide to move the boundary mark and start working the land and start operating on it, building on it, doing whatever, as if it were your own. Well, what is that called? Fraud. Okay? Fraud. Right? It's fraudulent. Because does that part of the land actually belong to you in reality? No. But you're living as if it does. Do you see what I mean? Right? It's fraudulent. So theft and fraud are often very unholy sisters. They go hand in hand, okay, in that regard. Right? Because when the person takes something that's not theirs and now assumes it unto themselves and lives as if it is theirs, that is obviously fraudulent. Okay? It's fraudulent. The claim that this belongs to you is a lie. That's what's meant by fraud. Okay? We are so consumed in this kind of theft and fraud that most people have never even alighted to the fact, because it is like the water that a fish swims in, that there's no concept almost. It's so ingratiated in everything that we do that often we can't even see it. It's just so common. We have a brilliant system, right, well beyond anyone of our control, in fairness, wherein we create money out of nothing. Someone wants a loan, they want it for a business, mortgage for a house, car loan, or any one of 1,000 other ridiculous, stupid loans you probably shouldn't take out, right? What happens? You go in, the bank does some magic juju on the keyboard of the computer, and poof, money appears in your account. Okay? It's not taken from somewhere else. It's not taken from other fractional reserves somewhere else in the banking system. It's just simply created. Okay? When a government needs to spend more money to fulfill the endless list of imbecilic and moronic campaign promises that they have made to us, the dullard electorate, where do they get that money from? Well, from the very same financial institutions that, through all manner of financial instruments and accounting trickery, print more and more and more money and increase the money supply. Right? Just print. Even to the point of egregious examples, like, say, the American government. Right? Their dollar was created in 1913, okay, about more than 100 years ago now. Right? Since COVID, the American government, as one example, we did a similar thing, just not to the same volume, right? Printed 4 times as much money in the last couple of years than of every single dollar printed in the last 100 years combined. Right? So take up every American dollar printed from 1913 to 2020, tally that up, right? And then multiply that number by 4, and that's the number that was printed in 2021 and 2022. Right? Now, we do a similar thing here, just again, not to the same gargantuan numbers of the Americans. What does that do? Right? You may have some economic education, you may have a lot, you may have none at all, that's totally cool. Right? What happens to the value of that dollar? right? The exact same effect as if you took that pile of money and just chucked it off of Echo Point, right? Goes falling down to the valley floor below, okay? That's what happens. Right? Now that is the entire perpetuation of our economy. The very economic system in which you and I live in is a system that is specifically designed and created to inflate the currency every single year. Right? They're called inflation targets, right? 2-ish% every year at least. Okay? It's often way more than just 2%, but the target is 2%. You notice, of course, how things cost more today. Your groceries cost more, your fuel costs more, all of your different rates cost more, this and that. Your taxes go up, not down, etc., etc. Right? Why? Because of this very problem. By inflating currency, you lose the power by which to purchase things. Now, here's where the rubber hits the road in regard to this command. Because I'm just using an example that you and I have no control over, to then give the examples of the ones that we do. Okay? So it cuts both directions. In this particular example of not moving boundary marks, of not stealing people's inheritances, because keeping in mind the land is the inheritance, right? That's what we're told there, okay? In your inheritance which you shall inherit, etc., right? And the good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. Who does inflation affect? Well, people in the future. You think it's bad for us who are alive now. Wait till that young baby grows up. Yeah? Wait till the children who have not even yet been born are born in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s. The inflation rate by that point, the national debt by that point, all these kinds of things. Because there are elements now where that does touch upon who we are and what we do. One of the fundamental reasons behind why governments spend infinite, inordinate amounts of money, incalculable and unknown to anyone, unaccountable to anyone, is what? I mentioned it earlier. Promises. Right? Promise after promise after promise. That is demanded by whom? The electorate. We want roads. We want a new airport. We don't want a new airport. We want this program. We want this funding for this disability and for this scheme and for this idea and this item and da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. The entire political system is one of the infinite demands of the people and politicians attempting to use the operative word, bribe, from corporations and from electorate in different ways, their votes. So as Christians, what do you think that should mean? Well, here's one of the things that it should mean. You should not be participating in it. Because if the things that as the electorate at least control the thing, touch on the side of things that you do have an ability to at least practically or pragmatically impact, right? If this political party is promising you this and this one is promising you that and this one's promising you something else, do we ever stop and think, will this make inflation go up or down? Will this increase the national debt or decrease the national debt? Will this make things harder for our children, our children's children in the future, economically and financially, or will it make it easier? Well, we don't think about any of those things. We don't, right? Individually, you might, and that's great. I'm talking about us collectively, as a people, as a nation. We don't think about those things. And all too often as Christians, we do not think about those things. We hear about this party promising such and such a program, a new fund, a new this, a new scheme of that, right? And yet never stop to think, what will this do to the wealth, to the economic ability and capability of our children and our children's children? Because when you put a nation further into debt, when you inflate the currency into oblivion, what happens? our children and our children's children and our children's children's children get poorer. We have over $1 trillion of national debt. Who inherits that? Well, the very same people that I talk to, he's pointing at me, yes, exactly. Yes, someone like my age. Yes, correct, thank you. Right? Who inherits that? The youth. And then after them, and after them. Right? That's who. And if I was twice the age I am now, the point that I'm making would still be correct. The point that I'm making has nothing to do by virtue of my own age. Right? Nothing I do, in fact, has anything to do with regard of my age. Certainly not while I'm standing here. Right? This is fundamentally true. Because especially thinking about the concept of moving boundary stones, right? We all, as Christians, should certainly desire to leave a better scenario, a better situation, a better country for our children than we found it. That would be a natural desire. But we are seeing the opposite. We're seeing the opposite. We are in a scenario where over a quarter of people retiring are upsizing in their houses in retirement. We're in a scenario where about half of people, roughly speaking, upon retirement are remortgaging in regard to loans and then spending all that money on cruises and holidays and goods and services and da-da-da-da-da. Right? We are in a scenario where in certain parts of the world, almost half of those above the age of 60 are leaving zero in inheritance. Now, of course, there are reasons given for that, right? Breakdown of family, strained relationships between parents and children. But when we're honest, who does that fall back on? Us. It falls back on parents. Again, there is mercy and grace in all things. God is able to forgive all of these various things. His grace surpasses the sins of our own lives. That's not in question. But how can a people possibly hope to fix a problem if the problem does not first be identified? If we don't first talk about that problem? Because you see, here's the bigger kicker. We've been talking about material things and a very limited material aspect here. Right? This is before we even get to the deeper side of the material, which of course is the spiritual. Not one in favour of the other or the other in favour of the one. Right? We're not Gnostics. We're not Eastern religions like Hinduism or Buddhism, where the material world is fundamentally corrupted and evil and beyond repair, and the whole point is to escape it, right? That's what Gnosticism taught in the ancient world. It's what modern Eastern religions teach. We're not that, okay? We're also not godless, atheistic materialists, as is the predominant philosophy today, where the only thing we're consumed with is football scores and Reserve Bank interest rates and the latest television show on channel whatever, right? Just purely material focus, right, with no concept or thought for the spiritual, for the theological, for the philosophical. Right? We, as Christians, hold both in perfect harmony, in symphony. Right? Because here is the spiritual side of this. Right? Undergirding all of this, if we think about the principle level, at the principle level, of moving boundary stones, it is not merely confined just to the literal act of actually moving a boundary stone, right? This point is actually made in Amos, for example, right? I'll just reference it in passing. Pardon me, Amos, Hosea. Where in Hosea chapter 5, verse 10 says the following, right? Simple sentence. The prince of Judah, so the princes, in other words, the rulers of Judah, have become like those who move the landmark. Okay? So they weren't accusing them of directly, actually, literally going out there and gerrymandering people's property lines, right? What Hosea here is rightly calling out from God to the rulers of Judah is that they become like those who move boundary marks. In other words, they become thieving frauds, right? Fraudulent thieves, or any one of another combination, okay? They become like that. So what's he doing, okay? He's highlighting it's not just the actual literal act of moving the boundary stone, because none of you have actually done that as far as I'm aware, right? Because we don't use boundary stones to mark boundaries, okay? We use lines on spreadsheets, on legal documents, sitting with a solicitor or an attorney somewhere, okay? That's what we do, right? It's deeper than just the actual physical act. It's the spirit behind the law that informs what the law is, okay? Taking that which is not your own is the flip side of disinheriting people. Okay? Because in this case, what was happening? Why is Hosea referring to this? Well, he's referring to it particularly and especially in the broader context of idolatry and of all the various things that kind of go along with that. Now, that's interesting. Why would this be mentioned? Because he's not the only one who does this, by the way. There are various others who do this, right? But Hosea is a very good example of this in chapter 5, verse 10. Why is he talking and criticizing rightly and condemning even the rulers of Judah, the princes, for moving boundary stones or being like those who move boundary marks in the context of false worship, of idolatry, of these kinds of other evils that go along with that? When our generation or generations cluster together, first slowly, but then surely and ultimately rapidly, apostatize, abandon God, the case of the ancient Israelites and Judah, syncretize the true worship of God with the false worship of idols, right? So false religion, okay? It is spiritually moving boundary marks. Or I suppose you could even say the other way around. Moving spiritual boundary marks. Here's the boundary mark, right? On this side of it is true worship. On that side of it is false worship. Do you see how that works conceptually? Right? What is the boundary mark in regard to the distinction or the designation between true worship and false worship? The law of God. The Word, right? The Word of God. Okay? Christ himself, as he commands, right? You shall do this. You shall not do that. Da-da-da-da-da. Okay? Right? That's the spiritual boundary mark that designates this side from that side. Okay? When human beings come along and start moving boundary marks, what are they now doing? They're violating the third commandment. Taking the Lord's name in vain. Right? We explained that back in Deuteronomy chapter 5 when we went through week by week, 10 weeks across each of the 10 commandments, if you recall. Okay? When we got to the third command, we explained and we saw what taking the Lord's name in vain kind of foundationally and fundamentally means. It means saying things that God did not say or not saying the things that God did say. Right? It's the very essence of what the serpent does, right? Did God really say in the garden? Okay? When one starts gerrymandering, right, changing up the divine law, what are you doing? You are moving the spiritual boundary marks. God said, here's the line, but you're saying it's over here. Right? See how that's working conceptually? Yep, good. Okay. When that happens, the very same action and, more importantly, consequence on the material side for stealing people's inheritances that we're talking about with regard to land or even in our context things like economics and money and so on, that's happening on the spiritual side. Because as Christians, what do we have a responsibility to do in the context of family? We have a responsibility to raise our children in the faith. Right? Raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and they shall surely not depart from it. Okay? There is an inherent covenantal promise that comes with the blessings and the grace of God, right? As the Apostle Peter says in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, verse 38. The promise is for you and for your children and for all who are far off. Right? There is this generational view inherent in the new covenant. Almost all the major baptisms in the book of Acts are what? Households. They're families. It's not just an individual. Okay? You get examples like that with the Ethiopian eunuch, but that's the exception to the rule. Okay? There's multi-generational focuses. Okay? Inheritance. Because is there anything more important that we as Christians can leave for our children and our children's children than the one true faith? Right? It's the single most important thing. We may not have great riches, materially speaking, in this world, right? For whatever particular reasons. But we have something that is an imperishable richness that is stored up for us in heaven, according to the author of the book of Hebrews. Right? That of the faith. That of God himself in Jesus Christ. In fact, spiritually speaking, again, all that language of inheritance is deeply important. In fact, it's not just important, it's vital to who Christ is. He is the one to whom God says in Psalm 2, "Ask of me, and I shall make the nations your inheritance, and the ends of the earth your possession." Your possession, the ends of the earth. That's the boundary mark of Christ's inheritance. Do you understand? Right? This is why various other elements of the prophets say that the coastlines, far off distant lands, they await God's law, right, his word, which of course has come to be fulfilled for 2,000 years now, as the gospel has spread forth, literally across the great oceans of the world, to distant shores, like this one, the one in which you stand now. The arrival of the gospel, ultimately on the 3rd of February, 1788, when the Reverend Richard Johnson, the chaplain of the First Fleet, stood at Sydney Cove and administered the first service and Holy Communion for the first time upon the Australian continent. Why? Because, to entirely appropriate a phrase for very obvious reasons, this land always was and always will be Jesus Christ's. Right? This country belongs to Jesus Christ. That's who it belongs to. Okay? And it belongs to those whom he has given it, in partnership with those who were here first, who have now, in many respects, been redeemed. Not totally, but growingly and increasingly. That's who this land belongs to. Which is precisely why so many of the great things that go on now, and by great I don't mean in the good sense, I mean great in terms of size, right? They're the opposite of good, they're evil. Right? Of importing countless millions of people from every corner of the earth who do not share our religion. It's one thing to share our religion. It's an entirely different thing to just import 10 trillion Indians and set up Hindu enclaves here. This land does not belong to Brahma, does not belong to Krishna, does not belong to Vishnu, does not belong to Shiva, does not belong to any of the demons that are worshipped in the Indian subcontinent. Okay? If anything, it's the opposite. That subcontinent belongs to Jesus Christ as well. So what happens when our political class and our corporate class and our financial banking class import all these people here for the same vacuous excuses of economics and equality and fairness and other such ludicrousness? En masse, in gigantic, just astronomical numbers. It is the disinheritance of our people. That is what it is. Right? It is not arriving here with the light of Christianity and of Christendom and the gospel and building things from nothing, of preaching the gospel as was done to the Aboriginal peoples. No, it is simply coming and taking. As a nation, we build nothing. We actually do the opposite. We simply extract, export to foreign nations, have them build it for us, and import it back in at a premium. That's what we do. And as Christians, we need to care more about this. Do you understand? We need to care more about this. We cannot, as people of faith and truth, sit idly by and watch as the people of Australia in general, but particularly if you're thinking children's children, the future aspect from that proverb, right? As the youth of today are disinherited. Okay? Because if you are a 20-year-old Australian kid, right, young man, young woman, you cannot outcompete the family of 27 that just moved in from the Sudan or from wherever. Pick a place. Right? You can't. That's why you can go to any auction in Sydney right now and the line will be down the street and round the corner with almost no native Australian people. For a foreign real estate agent selling to foreign people who arrived here very recently, and if they are with certain countries with whom our federal government has made deals, traitorous and treacherous as they are, like that of the Indian government or of others, you arrive here and you are receiving government funding through Centrelink, through the NDIS, or through any one of these other Ponzi schemes to give you money immediately. Who's that coming from? You and me. And all of what is being said here, as true as it is, as observable as it is, as entirely evidenced as everything that I'm saying here is, that we as Christians need to understand is going on, that we need to work against. It will be blindly shut down and decried using that magic word that we're all afraid of. I don't mean all of us, right? That so many people are afraid of. This spell that is cast upon you, that we attempt to avoid at all costs out of an irrational fear of man and a lack of the fear of God. Racist. The very nature of how this church operates, especially in a tourist town here like Katoomba, right, where we have millions of people visit across the year, right, certainly at its height, from all corners of the world, right, but especially the Asia-Pacific region, and we have people come here. It is ludicrous to even think about claiming that. Right? But that doesn't matter. Because those kinds of words, those magical spells that people, this is a whole other sermon, good grief, but these kinds of magical spells that are attempted to be cast of just calling people names doesn't actually address the fundamental issue. Right? There is the systemic disinheritance of European peoples in their native countries that is being undertaken at the international level by non-government and governmental organisations. And as Christians, we've been too complicit in that. For the reasons actually that got mentioned last week. False pity, right? Perverted pity arising from a false sense of piety, of the desire to be seen to do good as opposed to actually doing good. Because doing good also includes not abiding by, not tolerating, not accommodating, not aiding and abetting evil. But because we have been, that 20-year-old kid that I mentioned earlier, that 20-year-old young man or woman, will never own a home. In ever expanding and increasing parts of the major metropolises of Australia, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, etc., can barely afford to rent. I have friends who have law degrees from Sydney or from NSW who cannot find a place to rent. Certainly at least not east of Parramatta. A law degree. Is that a scenario that can be sustained? Can we possibly have a nation that ever hopes to even survive beyond this century if that's the circumstance in which we live? No. You can't. It just literally doesn't work. By definition, it crumbles and falls. Which is, sadly and unfortunately, unless something literally by virtue of divine intervention happens, that is what will occur. This will fall. Every other civilization and nation in history, ancient, medieval, and otherwise, that has done these things has fallen, and we are further down the track than what they were. Right? Take that as the guy who is learned and academically in history. Okay? Everything that caused the fall of Rome, both in its republic and its empire, when they did these things, literally to a T, by the way, the exact same things, we're doing, but worse. So then, what as Christians must we do in the face of that reality? Because please hear me, that is the reality. It is as dire and serious as it can possibly get, right? I get asked these things in Q&As, I get asked them in discussion time or question time at Bible studies, so on and so forth, all these kinds of questions, right? It's not to give you pure doom and gloom, right? When I say things like the fact that a lot of us today cannot even begin to understand or imagine how violently tumultuous and cataclysmic this century will become. Right? Because when this happened for the Romans, they didn't have computers, AI, and drones. They didn't have all the technological power and prowess, which only amplifies and expands the very thing. Right? I can't possibly stress this to you enough. Hear me? You are both unfortunate and immensely fortunate to be born at the time in which you live. And I say that for the eldest of us here to the youngest of us here. Why? If I can level with you for a moment and do one of the rare things that I ever do, which is get personal. Right? There are moments and instances in my own personal life at my age wherein, because it is my job in many respects to think about these things in great depth and breadth and to understand them and to think through it theologically, how can I minister and pastor my people? How can I lead them in that literal sense of pastoring, right, guiding and leading? How can I possibly advise people, right, especially people here locally who know I'm a minister, right? I get asked pastoral questions. I have non-Christians asking me questions when I'm exercising at the gym, when I'm getting a haircut, when I'm doing this and that, right? Who are all in the same boat, be they Christian or non-Christian in many respects in some of these earthly circumstances. There is the temptation to think, even for someone like me, right, in this escapist kind of way, gee, it would be nice to not live in times such as these. Right? Because for the vast majority of us as people, like I said, because we're such materialist consumerists, right, we're so literally consumed with the material world, right, all we see is who are the Panthers playing tonight, what stupid television show is on that's going to rot my brain, what's happening on Facebook, right? Just dumb things, right? That's what the average punter is consumed with, okay? When I look at these scenarios, right, I can see the tidal wave coming, yeah? That's already here in respects, but this is nothing compared to what will happen. Even I'm tempted being the operative word, toward hopelessness. Right? That is a true and genuine and very real existential anxiety, for lack of a better term, that my generation feels. Do you understand? Okay. The leading cause of death for anyone my age or below is suicide. Okay. To a rate that we have hardly ever experienced. In fact, almost never in modern recorded history. Right? Like less people committed suicide in occupied France, for example, in World War II, or in concentration camps, or in the Russian gulags at the hands of the communists in the Soviet Union. Less people committed suicide there than do young people in Australia today. Okay? Because there's just this bleak hopelessness, right? I've told you before about, back during COVID, right, that I personally know 7 people who killed themselves during COVID. That's just me, right? The worst example being a former schoolmate who had hundreds of thousands of dollars in business loans for a brand new enterprise that he had started all of 2 weeks prior, the very beginning of 2020, and then COVID shutdown happens. Well, the only way you got financial support from the government was to show multiple years of previous financial reports. Well, if you didn't have that, tough bickies. So what'd he do? Killed himself, right? Because he saw no way out. No, he's not a Christian, right? But that's what happens, okay? That is the exact amplified view of the vast majority of almost any young person you know my age or below, right? I'm 30, right? 30 below. Because of this. So then, much of what, to give you a little bit of inside knowledge, much of what I do in regard to things in the community with young people is centred around desperately attempting to show teenagers and 20-something-year-olds that as bleak and black as things are because of these things, because young people have, in every literal sense, been so materially and spiritually disinherited, that there is an absolute prevailing sense of hopelessness, of bleakness, right? Of blackness, okay? That there is actually a genuine hope. And it's not just hope in some far distant land somewhere. It's not hope that's only confined to the afterlife. Emphasis on the word only, because we do have hope in the afterlife. Right? We have hope through the resurrection in eternity. No one's denying that. But there is actually hope. Because Christ did not merely come to stamp your ticket to the pearly gates. Do you understand? That is not the end goal of Christianity. Right? That it sucks down here, but it'll be all fine when we get there. No. What is it? It is that as God reconciles the world unto himself, through himself, in himself, Jesus Christ, the divine and the human, reconciled in perfect harmony, that through his death and his resurrection unto immortality, his enthronement over the heavens and the earth, all authority and power being vested in him over the heavens and the earth, that in that and through that, truth, goodness, and beauty do not just merely exist in some ethereal reality somewhere else, but in this world. Yeah? That's why the prayer that he taught us to pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It's heaven and earth in harmony, not one in favor of the other, Gnosticism or materialist atheism. And we have become this. We have become consumed with greed. We have become consumed with pride. We've become consumed with selfishness. From the highest levels of banks and financial institutions and corporations and politicians all the way down to average, everyday Australians. Every one of us are indicted in this. There is no one who escapes the judgment of what we have been doing for 100 years now. Let alone the consequences that have been left in its wake for the youth of today, and then, good grief, the ones who haven't even been born yet. That in regard to this spiritual inheritance that I was mentioning earlier, what are we told? We're told many things. Paul in Galatians perhaps being the most operative. That in Christ, who is the seed of Abraham, singular, that's the point he actually makes in Galatians chapter 3. Not seeds plural, but seed singular, that is Christ, verse 6. All those who are in Christ receive the inheritance of Abraham. All of the promises given to Abraham belong to those who are in Christ because they belong to Christ. If we see a return to the Christian faith, if we therefore, again, not just in the conceptual sense, not only in that sense, but in the way that we therefore and thereby live, because those who come to faith in Christ, what do? We begin to order our lives in conformity to his word, to his commands, to his law, to what is good and true. What can we hope to do? We can hope to survive and persevere and endure through these various trials, because are we not told in the great wisdom that is given to us by the Apostle Paul that suffering creates character, that the character works through endurance, and that from that comes hope. That's what we're told. So no matter how old we are, how young we are, you are born at an incredible time. You are born at an exact time in which the very hope of the ages now rests in you. Notice I did not say it rests upon your shoulders, it rests upon someone else's shoulders, thank God, literally. But it lives in you. You are the guardians of our culture, of our people, of our religion. That in the midst of dark times, the light of the gospel of Jesus Christ shines forth from you. And what are we told in Matthew? To be a city set upon a hill, to not let our light be hid behind bushes, right? To be hid, yeah? But it's said to shine forth. Because all these things come into fruition, into harmony in the Christian faith. As Christians, we must leave an inheritance to our children and our children's children, materially and, most importantly, spiritually. So if you are in that older bracket, you need to be thinking about how you can, within whatever means and availabilities you have available to you, structure and leave a material inheritance, be it great or small, to those who come after you. Also, more importantly, equally importantly, if not even more importantly, leaving the inheritance of the faith in your own families, in your community, whatever it happens to be, both end. That's what this passage is calling us to do. That's what this passage is commanding you to do. That's what it's commanding myself to do. The way that we avoid moving boundary marks spiritually and materially is by taking serious once again the command that a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. Christians build the future because that's what we've always done. Everything we have and know, the laws, the architecture, the art, the education, the religion, all of it comes from our ancestors who built not for themselves, but for the future. Because the reality is that the reason why that proverb is so true, and I'll leave you with this, is because the humble and righteous man plants the tree in whose shade he knows he shall never sit, so that his children and his children's children may bask and live in the shade of that tree.